What's up everyone? Hope you're doing well. I want to share with you today some ideas on how to get retro or vintage style drum sounds. I've always loved vintage drum sounds in particular from the 60s and 70s. I thought it would be a cool experiment to try to recreate some of those sounds here at my studio. And by no means is this like the be all and all way to do this. I just kind of took it upon myself to experiment. I'm going to show you the drums I used and also the processing in Pro Tools. Let's check that out.
So the drum kit I used on these recordings was a 1960s Premier drum kit with an 18-inch bass drum, a 12-inch rack tom, and a 14-inch floor tom. And the snare drum was a Gretsch USA Custom Vinnie Colaiuta Signatures Series snare drum. So the drum heads that I used on the bass drum were Remo-coated Ambassadors, which are single-ply bass drum heads, and probably would have been the most common drum head in the 1960s. I tuned the drum to a medium tuning so it still had some tone. I did end up muffling it with a felt strip on the batter side, and I ended up taping a towel to the resonant side to take away some of the unwanted overtones. I also used a Vic Firth vintage wool beater, which is a really soft bass drum beater, and it gave the drum less attack and more tone. On the snare drum and toms, I used Remo-coated Ambassadors as well, and I tuned these drums to a medium to medium high tuning, almost like jazz drums, and I found that this gave it more of that 60s vibe because drummers in the 60s that were playing on Motown records and soul records and that kind of thing were coming out of the jazz world. They were jazz drummers. I also used muffling on the drums to take away some of the unwanted overtones. So on the floor tom, I used gaff tape. On the rack tom, I used a handkerchief across the drum. And then on the snare drum, I used an E-ring. For the drum overhead, I went with a mono overhead. I did this because, from what I understand, most of the drums in the 60s were recorded with a mono overhead. And I used a Warm Audio 47 Junior, which is a large diaphragm condenser microphone for this position. On the bass drum, I used an ATM 25, which is a dynamic microphone. On the snare, I used a Shure SM57, which is a pretty standard mic, but what's unusual about this is that it's not miking the top or the bottom of the drum, but it's actually miking the shell of the drum. I got this from watching some other resources on how to get vintage or retro drum sounds, and I guess this technique was used back in the 60s to mic snare drums. So I tried it and I thought it sounded cool, so I went with it. The next mic is the knee mic, and this is my personal favorite of this setup. For this mic position, I used an Electro Voice 635A from the 1960s, and this is a dynamic mic which has an omnidirectional polar pattern, so it's picking up a little bit of everything, but mostly the kick and the snare. And this is a huge part of the sound of this drum kit, and you'll hear that once we're in Pro Tools. Alright, so here we are in Pro Tools, and I want to share with you how I mixed these drums, and let's start with the mono overhead. So the first thing I added on the overheads was an EQ. Two moves being done here. The first is high pass, and that's just getting rid of some of the low end information that we don't really need in our overhead. And then the second one is a slight bump in the high mid-range to make the presence of the snare drum and hi-hats come through a little bit more. The next thing I added was a transient shaper. I did this because my drum room is pretty live sounding, and I wanted these drums to sound tight like they were recorded in a smaller room. So I used the sustain knob on the transient shaper to take off some of the sustain, and it really helped dry up the mono overhead sound. And the last thing I added on the overheads was a compressor. And this compressor is only compressing a few dB, and the main reason for this was just to give the overheads some more character and just a bit of life. So let's hear the overheads without any plugins, and I'll gradually add them in, and you can hear what they're all doing. So moving on to the bass drum, there's three things that are happening here. The first thing is a gate, and that's taking away some of the sustain of the bass drum and sort of focusing the drum and getting a more dead sound. And then the second thing is a tube mic pre, and that's adding some distortion and overtones to the drum. And then the last thing is a compressor, and that's giving the bass drum a little bit more punch. So let's hear the bass drum without any plugins, and I'll gradually add them in and you can hear what all the plugins are doing. Moving on to the snare drum, there were two things that I did here. The first thing was an EQ. I added some high mid-range and I also high-passed the snare drum. And then the next thing was a bit of compression with an LA2A style compressor to give it some punch. So next we have the knee mic, and this was the microphone that was placed right over the bass drum, pointing at the snare, and it was an omnidirectional dynamic mic. So this mic picked up a lot of bass drum and a lot of snare drum. It's a big part of this drum sound. And you'll hear that this mic is probably the loudest mic in the whole drum mix. There was quite a bit of processing done on this microphone. I used a noise gate to get rid of some of the other drums other than the bass drum and snare drum. I wanted this to be mostly kick and snare. I then used a trimmer to boost the volume, and that drove it into a tube style mic pre, which added a lot of distortion. That saturation knob is dialed. Then on the EQ, we have some high mids being added and taking out some of the boxiness as well. And then lastly, we have a compressor, which is smashing the sound. Now let's move on to the drum bus, which has a lot of processing going on. So the first thing was a tape plugin, which was adding some saturation and distortion to the sound. So the next plugin is the RC20 Retro Color plugin, which is an awesome plugin. There's a couple things being done. The first thing is there's some distortion being added to some certain frequencies with the crunch module. And then the next thing was some EQ being done at the bottom. There's a low pass filter just shaving off the top end. So next we have some EQ. We have some high mids being added and then some low end being added. Looks like some 60 hertz. And then also a bit of high passing going on at the bottom. And then finally we have some compression being added with the LA2A style compressor. And then to glue it all together at the end, we have this Fairchild style compressor. So moving on to the master bus, there's quite a bit of processing done on the master bus as well, because I actually track these drums to a background track and I mixed them together. And the processing on the master bus sort of glued the track of music and the drums together. But I'm going to leave these master bus plugins on so you can hear what they're doing to the drums, because they are adding a lot to the drum sound as well. So on the master bus, we have a tape plugin adding some saturation. Then we have a virtual console plugin, which is adding some transformer style distortion. And then we have the RC20 Retro Color plugin again. And this one is on a preset called Vinyl 3, which is basically making it sound like it came off of an old record. Just want to point out too that there is some EQ being done on this plugin as well. There's a bit of high and low pass filtering going on. And then we have another Fairchild style compressor to glue it all together. And the last plugin is the Ozone 9, and I put this plugin on an AI feature which sort of masters the track by itself, and it actually did EQ the track. It put some low and high end back in, but the main reason for this plugin was to bring it up to a proper listening level. So let's check out the master bus without any plugins, and then we'll gradually add them in.